The church looked peaceful from the outside, with morning light pouring through stained glass and dust drifting in soft lines across the wooden pews. Folks had come from every ranch, farm, and trading post within half a day's ride just to witness the wedding. It was meant to be a celebration, the kind small towns used to cling to when life grew hard. Horses were tied to fences out front, babies were carried on hips, and women in Sunday dresses whispered about the bride's quiet nature and how she deserved a gentle future. No one expected trouble. Certainly not the kind that would make the entire room fall silent, like wind dying before a storm. The groom walked in first, boots heavy against the floor, shoulders straight as if he already owned everything his eyes touched. Folks said he had charm when he wanted to show it, and he always acted like nothing in the world could stand in his way. The bride followed, holding a small bunch of wildflowers picked just before dawn. She walked with slow steps, almost as if she would turn around if she moved too fast. Her dress was plain cotton, sewn by neighbors who cared more about her comfort than fashion. Her hair was tied back simple, and her eyes stayed lowered as she reached the altar. People assumed she was shy. Some thought she felt blessed. A few noticed something else in her hands, a faint tremble she tried to hide. She wasn't crying, but her eyes held a quiet kind of fear. It's a kind that slips through a person who's been pushed too far before they learn to speak up. She had no father to give her away, and no family sitting in the pews. Only a few ranch wives who promised to stand behind her, though they stayed far from the front, where men tended to keep control of things. The vows began, steady and traditional. The preacher spoke about honor, respect, and what it meant to protect a home. The bride barely lifted her voice, whispering her part with the soft tone of someone who wasn't sure she had the right to speak loud in a world that liked to decide things for her. The groom spoke his vows with pride, loud enough that the room shook with his certainty. He pulled her closer, squeezing her wrist with a grip firm enough to make her wince. People noticed that. They shifted, uneasy. But weddings can make folks overlook things they should question. When the preacher said she may speak her final promise, her words came out slow. She said she would try to build a peaceful home. She did not say she loved him. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she had never been given the choice. The groom didn't like how quiet she sounded. He muttered something under his breath, eyes sharp with anger as if her silence insulted him. Before anyone could step in, he yanked her closer and struck her across the face, loud enough that the sound echoed between stone walls. The room froze. Wildflowers slipped from her hands, scattering petals across the aisle. Women gasped. Some men stood half out of their seats as if unsure whether to interfere. The bride held her cheek, stunned, eyes watering not from pain but from the shame of being hit in front of a town that promised to witness her future. She stepped back, trembling but didn't speak. It wasn't the first time someone had taken their temper out on her. It might have been the first time she had been struck in public. The groom smirked, acting as if nothing happened, as if she belonged to him now, and that gave him the right to shape her however he wanted. He reached for her again, ready to pull her forward and finish the ceremony. But he never got the chance. A heavy church door swung open at the back. The room turned, whispers cutting through the air like dry leaves across desert ground. Tall, broad, and unhurried, an Apache warrior walked straight down the aisle. He carried a carved spear in one hand, feathers tied in his hair, tribal markings painted across his face and shoulders. His chest was bare, his steps firm, and his expression calm in a way that carried more threat than a shout ever could. He did not rush, he did not bow his head, and he did not look like a man who feared what anyone in that room thought of him. People slid aside as he passed, unsure whether to hide or stare. Some men reached for weapons, but none were fast enough to draw. The bride looked up at him, eyes widening as if she recognized something about him. Maybe from long before this church, long before this dress, long before she learned how to stay silent. He stopped between the pews, the groom standing across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Dust hung in still air, sunlight burned through stained glass, and every heartbeat in the room seemed to pound louder than the church bell outside. Then the warrior raised his spear just enough to make the point clear. His voice was steady, not shouted, not angry, just carved from something ancient. Lay a hand on her again. No one moved. The groom's smile fell away. His face turned red with anger and embarrassment. He tried to speak, but the words dried up as the warrior stepped closer. The bride watched both men, torn between fear and a strange sense of safety. As if someone finally stood between her and a life she never chose, the preacher backed away a little, unsure whose side to take. The church doors remained open behind the warrior, letting in cold wind that rustled dresses and coats. The room felt caught between two worlds, the quiet traditions of small-town life and the raw strength of a people who lived by honor. Instead of appearances, the groom clenched his fists. Ready to fight, but deep down he knew a man who walked into a church alone and uninvited with nothing. But a spear probably had reasons stronger than pride. The question wasn't whether he would try to strike again. It was whether the bride wanted to stay at the altar or walk through those open doors into a fate no one understood yet. She looked at the pews, at faces filled with judgment and curiosity. Then she looked at the warrior, and something inside her shifted, not loud or dramatic. Just a quiet spark she had forgotten she ever carried. The petals on the floor marked the place where her past fell away like torn pages of a worn book. The room waited. She breathed slowly. And as she stepped back from the altar, the entire church leaned forward, waiting to see who she would become once she truly chose her own path. Every eye in the church stayed locked on the bride as she stepped away from the altar. Her heart hammered against her ribs, uncertain whether she had just escaped one danger or stepped into another. The groom's breath came rough and loud, boots scraping against the wood floor as he tried to decide what to do next. No one dared to speak. Folks held their breath, wondering what would follow now that an Apache warrior stood between a bride and a man who believed she was his. The warrior didn't look away from the groom, not even once. He stood calm, like someone who had already faced storms and survived worse than anything this town could throw at him. The spear in his hand stayed steady, but his voice softened just a little as he said to the bride that she was free to choose where she stood. She had never heard someone say those words like they truly meant them. She swallowed hard, her fingers shaking as she reached for the wildflowers on the floor. But they were crushed and bruised under boots. She'll let them be. Her cheeks still burned from the slap, yet something deeper hurt more. It was the thought that if this wedding moved forward, her life would be nothing but more moments like that. The warrior angled his head slightly toward the open doors, as if guiding her toward fresh air and sunlight, toward freedom. She looked over her shoulder. Outside, the sky looked wide enough to swallow her whole. The wind carried the smell of horses and sagebrush, so different from the suffocating perfume of the church. Before she could move, the groom finally found his voice. He stepped forward with a roar, pointing at the warrior as if trying to gather the crowd behind him. He said the bride was his, that arrangements had been made, that she belonged here. But his voice cracked, revealing fear beneath the anger. He looked around, searching for support, but the room stayed painfully quiet. A few people lowered their eyes so they wouldn't have to choose a side. The warrior didn't raise his spear.
Ow.
But he stood taller, as if his very presence pushed back against the groom's claim. He told the groom that a woman was not something to be owned. He spoke in simple words, yet they carried centuries of belief. He said she was human and deserved dignity. The bride felt those words settle deep inside her bones. Like soil softening after long drought, the groom's pride swallowed any hesitation. He took one step too close. In an instant, the warrior shifted, holding the spear before him with practiced strength, making it clear just how easy it could be to end this fight before it started. The groom froze. The church felt like it might burst from the tension. The bride whispered to the warrior, asking how he knew her. His dark eyes flicked toward her for a heartbeat. He said he had seen her before, out near the borderlands where settlers and Apache paths sometimes crossed. She had been lost once, alone on a trail leading nowhere. He remembered how she looked that day, clutching her coat tight against the cold wind, trying to hide the bruises left by the same man who now demanded her loyalty. He said he had never forgotten the way she had looked up at him with silent fear, as if begging someone to notice she was hurting. She looked at him now, suddenly remembering a distant evening, a path fading into dusk, a stranger on horseback who didn't speak but nodded once with understanding as he rode on. She never thought she would see him again. The preacher finally found courage to speak. He said anger had no place in a house of worship and asked both men to lower their weapons and pride. He glanced at the bride, asking if she wanted to continue her vows. His tone pleaded for peace, for the ceremony to end without scandal or spilled blood. She didn't answer. Her voice still felt trapped by years of fear, so she let her feet speak instead. She stepped back one more pace, away from the groom. A small gasp rippled through the pews. That tiny motion stirred the groom to lunge in her direction, more desperate than brave. But the warrior blocked him, silent as a wall of stone. The warrior motioned for the bride to stand behind him. She obeyed, not because she was ordered, but because she felt safer there. Her hands held the back of his belt like a child, clinging to a lifeline. For the first time that morning, her breathing eased. The groom spit insults, saying the Apache was nothing but a savage trespasser, demanding the sheriff arrest him. But the sheriff hadn't been invited to the wedding. Maybe the groom expected nothing would go wrong. Maybe he thought fear alone could keep the bride in place. Outside, a faint sound of horses carried from the road. The warrior's tribe was never far behind when one of their own wandered into town. A few riders appeared in the distance, silhouettes against the sunlight. Townsfolk edged closer to the pews, unsure whether to hide or watch history unfold right in front of them. The bride's mind drifted to her past. 2 days before fear had become her shadow, she had grown up at a small ranch her parents worked until sickness took them both. When she was orphaned, the groom's family offered to take her in. At first it felt like kindness, but soon she learned kindness can turn into a cage. Every chore became a demand, every silence became a threat. When she turned older, the groom insisted she would be his someday. Her voice was never part of the decision. She survived those years by numbing her heart, pretending each sunrise meant a new chance. But the night before the wedding, she stared at her reflection and wondered if this was all her life would ever be. She didn't ask for a hero. She didn't expect one. Yet here he stood. The warrior didn't shout or brag. He simply told the groom that if the bride wanted to leave, then she would leave, and no man would stop her. People tried to read his face, but the truth lived in his silence. He wasn't there to steal her. He was there to protect what should have never been taken. The bride looked toward the open doors again. Freedom waited, but fear clung to her ankles. If she stayed, the warrior would be outnumbered. If she left, the groom might hunt her. And the world outside the church walls didn't promise safety either, she asked the warrior in a voice, barely above a breath why he cared. For a long second, he didn't answer. Then he said something that made her heart twist. He said that once, long ago, women of his own people suffered under the hands of men who forgot what honor meant. Warriors vowed that would never happen again. He would not stand by while cruelty wore the face of a husband. The bride's eyes stung again, but these tears felt new. She realized she wasn't alone anymore. Someone finally saw her. The church remained silent, waiting for the bride to make the next move. She had always been pushed, pulled, demanded, and ordered. Now she was being given a choice, and the weight of it pressed so deep it almost hurt. The warrior extended his hand only halfway, not grabbing, not urging, just offering. His calloused fingers waited, patient as mountains. The groom thrashed forward again, shouting that she was his property. But his words felt weaker, like a fire losing all oxygen. The bride looked at her left hand, the one that would have worn a ring meant to bind her to pain. She curled her fingers into a fist, telling herself quietly that she deserved better. Slowly, she lifted one foot and placed it behind the warrior, then another. She stood fully behind him, choosing her place. Gasps fluttered like birds startled from a tree. The warrior shifted so he shielded her completely. The groom's face twisted into something dangerous as he realized control had slipped from his grasp. The preacher clutched his Bible like a shield. Townsfolk braced themselves for what might happen if rage overpowered reason. The groom swore he would not let her go. He promised she would regret this. His boots dragged across the floor as he prepared to charge, a reckless fury taking over. The warrior planted his spear, feet firmly on the ground, waiting for the storm to come. Outside, hooves thundered closer. Inside, breath held tight like a rifle ready to misfire. The bride squeezed the warrior's belt a little tighter, knowing that no matter what happened next, this was the first time in her life she had chosen her own future. The church doors rattled as more riders arrived. The groom lunged forward with a wild yell, and the warrior lowered his stance. Ready to defend her with everything he had, suspense climbed like a rising wind, and no one knew whose world would break first when the next heartbeat finally fell. The groom's furious charge never reached its target the way he intended. A rancher sitting near the aisle grabbed his coat and held him back just long enough for the warrior to step between them. The church erupted into noise, voices clashing, boots scraping, and pews rattling as people tried to decide whether to intervene or get out of the way. Mothers rushed their children toward the back doors, while a few men whispered that the town couldn't afford bad blood with any Apache band, especially not one that moved through the region with strong warriors and old loyalties. The bride stayed close behind the warrior, her breath unsteady, hands now clasped together at her chest instead of holding on to him. She felt guilty for hiding, yet she knew if she tried to stand in the center of this storm alone, she would be broken again. The groom shoved free from the rancher holding him and pointed at the warrior, declaring that this was an act of intrusion, a threat, an attempt to steal what was promised to him. His voice cracked with desperation more than anger now, because the truth was clear to everyone watching. If the bride really wanted him, she would not be standing where she stood. The warrior did not answer right away. His silence was unsettling. The bride wondered if he was waiting for the groom to make the next move, or if he was waiting for her to speak first. She opened her mouth, but words still felt heavy on her tongue. She had been quiet for so long that speaking now felt like pushing against iron walls. Then the church doors burst wider, and several riders appeared outside, dismounting quickly. They wore traditional clothing, armed but calm, eyes scanning the town with caution. They did not rush inside or draw weapons. They simply formed a presence, enough to warn anyone who might think of raising a gun. One of them stepped forward, a woman older than the warrior. She had long braids wrapped with strips of leather, and her expression carried the weight of someone who had lived through battles and kept memories sharp. She stood just outside the threshold of the church, watching with a steady gaze that made some men step back without realizing why. The preacher tried again to calm the room. He said that this was not a battlefield, that a church was meant for vows, not violence. He turned to the bride, asking if she wished to continue, or if she chose to call the wedding off. The bride trembled, but she finally spoke, voice soft and cracked. She said she did not want to marry him. She said she was afraid of what her life would become if she did. The groom barked out that fear was normal, and she just needed time to adjust, that he would give her a good life. But his tone betrayed him. Everyone heard the threat hiding beneath his promises. The warrior stepped sideways just enough to shield her from the groom's path again. His spear stayed angled low but ready. His stance shifted not toward attack, but toward endurance, as if he expected the fight might last longer than one strike. The groom shouted that the Apache had no right to interfere in the affairs of settlers. A few men behind him nodded, clutching their coats where they kept revolvers hidden. Their loyalty had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with pride. The warrior finally spoke, telling them that land did not belong to one people, and neither did the woman in question. He said he had no interest in taking her for himself, only in making sure she was not taken by force. That struck the groom harder than any fist could. The idea that someone could step between him and what he wanted simply because it was right, not because they wanted power, confused him. Men like him understood rivalry, not protection. Outside, the older woman called to the warrior in their own language. Her voice held warning. The bride could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. The warrior replied calmly, not turning his back on the scene unfolding inside. The bride felt torn. She was grateful for the warrior's help, but she feared that her presence was dragging him into something far larger than a broken wedding. She whispered that he should leave before more trouble arrived, before the town made him the enemy. The warrior turned slightly, answering that trouble already found them, and leaving her wouldn't undo anything. The groom took a step toward the pews, raising his hands as if preparing to speak to the crowd rather than the warrior. He told everyone that the bride was unstable, that she didn't know what she wanted. She had been taken advantage of by outside influence. He crafted his lie carefully, trying to sway public opinion. Some people hesitated, unsure who to believe. They had only known the bride in silence, and they had known the groom as a man who always got what he aimed for. The bride realized that staying silent would only make things worse. She stepped out from behind the warrior, not too far, just enough to be seen. Her voice shook, but she said she wasn't confused. She said she knew exactly what she feared, and she feared the life waiting behind that altar. She told the townsfolk that she had been forced into believing marriage meant survival. She said she wanted her life to be her own. Her words hung heavy, and many women in the church lowered their eyes. Understanding more deeply than they could admit aloud, the groom's face reddened with humiliation. He lunged again, not at the bride this time, but at the warrior. The strike was clumsy and fueled by panic. The warrior sidestepped and caught the groom by the wrist, holding him long enough to force him back without harm. It wasn't a violent gesture, more like a warning carved in silence. The groom stumbled, covering with a glare that promised revenge. He shouted that this wasn't over and stormed out through a side exit. A few of his supporters followed, whispering plans. The door slammed behind them, leaving the church echoing with unsettled quiet. The bride finally exhaled, but relief didn't come. She knew leaving the church didn't mean she was safe. It meant the real fight had just begun. The warrior told her they needed to leave before the groom gathered men willing to use force. The older woman outside agreed, explaining that some farmers already rode toward the sheriff's office. Soon there would be lawmen, and the story might twist into something it was never meant to be. The bride looked back at the altar, at the crushed petals, at the pews filled with people who didn't know whether to help her or pretend they never saw what happened. She realized she could not return to the life she had before this morning. The warrior motioned for her to follow. The older woman stepped aside, creating a path toward the horses waiting outside. The bride hesitated only once, glancing over her shoulder at the preacher. He nodded quietly, offering no judgment, just understanding. She stepped through the doorway into the sunlight. As soon as her feet hit the ground outside, she felt the world widen around her. The warrior walked beside her as the riders mounted. She didn't know where they would go or what would come next. She only knew that the groom wouldn't let humiliation settle without trying to reclaim control. Somewhere in the distance, men were already saddling horses for pursuit. Wind carried dust across the road. Saddles creaked. The warrior mounted his horse and offered the bride a hand to ride behind him. She took it, steadying herself. The moment she settled on the horse, the warrior looked toward the horizon, then toward the road behind them where trouble gathered. They rode forward, leaving the church shrinking behind them. While danger grew in the path they could not see yet, and though she didn't know what future waited, the bride felt her heart beat steady, not with safety, but with the first taste of freedom she had ever known. The trail out of town stretched long and dry. Beneath the afternoon sun, a narrow path threading through brush and open prairie. The bride held tightly to the warrior's waist as the horse moved with steady rhythm, her breath still uneven from everything that happened in the church. She didn't feel safe yet, only removed from danger by a fragile distance. Behind them, the sound of hooves rumbled faintly on the wind. It was hard to tell if it was just her heartbeat or riders. Already closing in, the older woman riding beside them urged the group to speed up. She warned that the groom would not accept humiliation quietly. Men like him believed that losing control was the same as losing power. The bride knew she wasn't just running from a marriage. She was running from an entire life built on silence. The warrior glanced back, eyes sharp. He told her not to fear the path ahead, only the one she walked away from. She wanted to believe him, but she knew how far a determined man could ride when rage guided his reins. Every time the wind shifted, she felt like she could hear her name being shouted from a distance. As they rode farther from town, the landscape changed. Grass gave way to rocks and steep ridges carved by years of wind. The warrior guided the group toward an area where narrow canyons twisted through the land like forgotten scars. He said it was a place where riders could hide if needed, a place where the earth itself shielded those who didn't have the luxury of walls. The bride adjusted her hold as the horse climbed a rocky slope. She finally asked why he remembered her from that night long ago. The warrior answered quietly that he noticed anyone who walked alone. He said loneliness has a sound, and hers echoed loudly even across open plains. She stared at his back, unsure how to respond. His words struck something in her heart, something that hadn't felt warm in years. They reached a wide clearing where the group stopped to water the horses. A thin stream cut across the dust, reflecting sunlight like scattered silver. The bride climbed down and steadied herself on shaking legs. The freedom felt unreal. Like a dream fragile enough to vanish with one wrong breath, the warrior crouched beside the stream, washing his hands and face. He looked calmer than anyone should after confronting a town alone. The bride knelt beside him, cupping water in her palms. She noticed small marks on his shoulder, scars that told stories without needing explanation. Before she could ask about them, one of the riders whistled sharply. He pointed toward the west ridge where dust rose in a thick line. The groomsmen were coming. More riders than she expected, at least a dozen, maybe more. Some carried rifles. Others rode with fury rather than reason. The warrior stood, water dripping from his hands. The older woman stepped forward, telling the bride this moment would define more than just her future. If she returned, the town would think she regretted leaving. If she ran, they would think she was guilty of something. If she stood her ground, she might finally claim a voice that had been denied for years. The bride's throat tightened. She didn't feel strong enough to shape any future. It's only scared enough to know she couldn't go back. The warrior mounted his horse again, spear resting across his legs. He did not look at the bride at first. Instead, he watched the dust cloud grow. When she finally spoke, she said she did not want anyone to die because of her. His eyes softened as he told her that sometimes battles choose people, not the other way around. He reminded her that she didn't start this conflict. She only stopped pretending she wasn't trapped. The riders behind the groom slowed as they reached the foothills. They spread out, trying to box the group in. The leader raised his hand, signaling for the bride to return peacefully. He shouted that the groom deserved justice and that she had embarrassed him. He claimed she was being manipulated. The bride stepped forward, legs trembling, and shouted back that she left by choice. Her voice cracked but did not break. The groom rode to the front, glaring at her from across the distance. He lifted his arm and pointed directly at her, demanding she return before he dragged her back by force. His horse pawed at the dirt, matching the anger in his eyes. The warrior nudged his horse forward, closing part of the distance. He said the bride had made her choice, and anyone who tried to take her would answer to him. His voice carried across the canyon like thunder. The standoff grew still, both sides measuring the cost of the moment. The groom raised a hand to signal his men, but before he could bring it down, a rifle cracked from the far ridge. No one fired it from either side. A third presence had arrived, hidden in the rocks, watching the scene unfold with unknown intentions. The shot didn't hit anyone, but the echo shook every rider. The bride stepped back, searching for where it came from. Shadows moved between jagged stones high above. The warrior lifted his spear, eyes narrowing. He recognized the movement as something more dangerous than the groom's rage. He whispered that someone else was watching, someone waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The groomsmen grew restless. Some pulled rifles. Others looked around nervously, unsure whether they were now trapped in someone else's fight. The bride felt her chest tighten. She realized this wasn't just about her anymore. If a fight broke out here, both sides would suffer, and she would be the spark blamed for every wound. The warrior signaled his riders to spread out. The older woman circled wide, scanning the ridges. The bride stayed close to the stream, gripping a handful of dirt just to feel something real. The groom dismounted and began climbing rocks toward the ridge, shouting that whoever fired that shot needed to show themselves. The warrior told him to stop, that running toward unseen danger was foolish. The groom ignored him. His pride drove him forward, blind to anything except revenge and control. The bride called after him, voice raw, telling him to turn back. He didn't. The sound of loose gravel followed his climb, each step echoing farther from reason. As he reached the upper ledge, another figure appeared from behind a boulder. The bride's heart froze. She couldn't tell if it was another Apache, a bandit, or someone else entirely. The figure held a gun and stepped into sight, face half covered by a scarf. Their eyes met the groom's with cold calculation. The warrior kicked his horse forward, racing up the slope, knowing what would happen if he didn't reach them in time. Dust exploded under hooves. The bride screamed his name, reaching out though she couldn't follow fast enough on foot. The groom raised his weapon. The stranger raised theirs. The canyon fell silent, waiting for the first shot to break everything apart. The warrior climbed fast, determination burning through every movement. The bride stumbled forward, running after him with no plan, only fear. She didn't know who would fire first, who would fall, or whether her freedom would end with blood on stone. The moment grew so tight that even the wind held its breath, and just as the two guns leveled at each other, life balanced on a single heartbeat. Everything that led them here poised to shatter at once. The groom and the stranger stared each other down on that narrow ridge, both armed, both shaking with a different kind of desperation. Wind whipped dust across the rocks. The whole canyon felt like it was holding its lungs tight, waiting to see who would fire the first shot. The bride stopped halfway up the slope, her hands pressed against the stone, heart pounding hard enough to dizzy her. She wanted to scream, to run forward, to do anything that could stop what was about to happen, but the moment felt frozen in place. Like time itself refused to move. The warrior reached the ledge first. He leaped off his horse before it even stopped, boots scraping across the rock. He grabbed the groom's arm, pushing the barrel of his gun away, just as the stranger pulled their trigger. The shot fired into the sky, harmless but loud enough to send birds flying from the cliffside. Echoes bounced across the valley like thunder rolling through canyon walls. The stranger cursed under their breath and tried to fire again. But the older woman rose from behind a pile of rocks and knocked the gun from their hand with her staff. It clattered down the slope, landing not far from the bride's feet. She stared at the weapon, as if it were a piece of her past, finally slipping out of reach. The stranger fled, sprinting along the ridge before anyone could catch them. They disappeared into the rocks, leaving only dust in their wake. The groom and the warrior stood panting, one fueled by anger, the other by purpose. The groom looked as if he wanted to fight again, but his feet staggered, and his strength finally cracked. He looked down at the group below and realized no one was rushing to defend him anymore. Even the men who rode with him shifted uncomfortably, as if they finally saw the truth of the man they followed. The bride reached them, knees weak, lungs burning. She called out to the groom, telling him that this needed to end. Her voice didn't tremble this time. She said that whatever happened between them wasn't just about broken vows, but about the choices that led her into silence. She told him she forgave him, not because he deserved absolution, but because she refused to carry the weight of hatred into her new life. The groom's shoulders dropped as though someone cut strings holding him up. For the first time that day, he looked less like a man seeking control and more like someone lost in his own rage. He tried to speak, but no words came. He simply turned away and walked back down toward his horse. The men who followed him hesitated, then joined him silently. No one rode forward. No one tried to drag her away. Their anger dissolved into dust as the sun dipped lower. Turning the trail golden, the warrior stayed still until the groom's group vanished across the horizon. Only then did he approach the bride, asking softly if she was hurt. She shook her head and let her legs fold beneath her, sitting on the warm stone. She whispered that she felt tired, not from running, but from years of holding her voice back. He sat beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. The silence felt safe this time, not heavy. The older woman joined them, saying the stranger on the ridge was likely someone hired to stir trouble, someone hoping to create a fight that would benefit nobody but themselves. She said the world was full of people who sought conflict just to profit from the ruin. The bride nodded slowly. She understood now that running wasn't enough. She had to live differently too. She had to choose something better. They traveled with the Apache riders for several days. moving through valleys where grass swayed like waves and nights rustled with fire crackles and stories. The bride helped gather water, learned how to braid rope, and sat with elders who spoke of strength built from patience. The warrior kept a quiet watch over her, never hovering, never pressing, only making sure she felt safe. One evening, under soft moonlight, she finally told him about her childhood, about being taken in by people who offered a home only to demand obedience. She said she learned to be invisible, to avoid trouble, to survive by shrinking instead of growing. The warrior listened without interrupting, hands resting on his knees. When she finished, he said that people are not meant to shrink. They are meant to take up space in the world. He told her she had already begun. In return, he shared that he had lost people in past conflicts. He carried scars not just on his skin, but in memories of villages burned and promises broken. He said protecting her at the church wasn't just an act of honor. It was a reminder of who he vowed to be, for his people and for himself. Their bond didn't grow from urgency, but from something slower, something built from shared wounds and the hope of healing. They didn't need to speak it aloud. It formed in small moments, like when she handed him a cup of water, or when he tied a blanket around. Her shoulders before nightfall settled cold across the plains. Eventually, they reached a settlement where the bride chose to stay for a time. It wasn't a town built on fear, but a place where trading, planting, and living meant working together. She helped with crops, tended to children, and felt herself growing stronger. Voice becoming steadier day by day. Word later reached them that the groom had left town entirely. Some said he took work far north. Others said he tried to start fresh where no one knew his past. The bride wished him no harm. She simply wished never to cross that path again. Seasons turned. The bride found that freedom didn't always mean ease. Sometimes it meant facing days when she wasn't sure who she was becoming. But now she had the chance to find out. The warrior visited often, sometimes with riders, sometimes alone. Their conversations deepened. He walked beside her now, not as a savior or a shield, but as someone who respected her right to choose every step of her path. On a warm spring morning, she stood at the edge of a riverbank, watching sunlight dance across rippling water. The warrior stepped beside her. She told him she no longer lived in fear of belonging to someone. Now she wanted to choose who walked beside her, not out of survival, but out of trust. He met her gaze, understanding without needing further words. Their hands touched gently, fingers curling together not with urgency, but with certainty. It felt like the beginning of a life shaped by both strength and tenderness. The river kept flowing, carrying old pain downstream and leaving room for something new. In the quiet that followed, she realized freedom wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning, and together they walked forward into a future built not by fear, but by choice.